focused on.
We're going to end up in World War III with this guy.
I don't think we need a wider war in the Middle East. That's not what I'm looking for.
No, Joe Biden will not start an active war, no matter what happens in the Middle East. Two reasons. The first one is hard to miss. It's 6 feet 3 inches tall, and its name is Donald Trump.
They're pro-war. We don't want war. We got out of all the wars. We beat the hell out of ISIS.
Yes, Donald Trump is running for president with the narrative that Joe Biden has pulled America into wars.
That's the biggest threat that we have to democracy. We're going to end up in World War III with this guy running things.
Now, American voters may remember that there were US boots on the ground in Afghanistan throughout Trump's time in the White House, and that the assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani was to all intents and purposes a war crime. But the message Trump is hammering home is that right now, the US is preparing for war on 3 fronts: Iran, Russia, China. And whether those wars turn into active conflicts for the US or not, it's still on Biden's watch. So you can see why any escalation in the Middle East crisis could prove very, very problematic for Joe Biden in an election year. He doesn't want to play into Trump's hands and be the president who started a new war in the Middle East just months away from elections. Now, Joe Biden came to power with promises of calming down global temperatures. And under Biden, the US has pulled out of Afghanistan. A move that on paper may have ended a forever war, but it was hardly a never again. And it made many American allies question US foreign policy and influence. The foreign policy looked confused. The influence was very, very clearly ebbing. And then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, triggering sound and fury from the West and several confident predictions of how Russia wouldn't last 6 months. 3 years into that conflict, Putin appears stable, confident, and definitely about to sweep his own elections, none of which applies to the American president.
He doesn't come across as very forceful, and we're in a pretty tough time right now. I mean, the whole world could go to war, and I think we need some really tough leadership. We need experienced and tough leadership.
The man can't put 2 sentences together. He can't find the stairs off a stage.
So now, in an election year, and with the opinion polls against him, Joe Biden faces a domestic dilemma. Should he double down hard in retaliation for the American deaths in the Middle East? After all, that would perhaps be the natural response for a commander-in-chief.
American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances is what keep us, America, safe.
For Biden, the most natural response is a carefully calibrated series of strikes, specifically on militant groups in Syria and Iraq, which the White House has repeatedly reminded the world are funded by Iran. Now, despite calls from Republicans to hit Iran now and hit Iran hard, this is really all that the US can practically do. It can't withdraw its troops from the region because not only will that be seen as a humiliating exit, it would leave this strategically sensitive region to its own devices at a time when anti-American fervor here is at a peak. Now, why exactly this region is strategically sensitive, we'll leave that for another full video of its own. But America's closest ally, Israel's interests, must also be considered and is no doubt being highlighted at every opportunity by the powerful Jewish American lobby.
We stand with Israel!
Israel is certainly not going to want the US backing down or even to be seen backing down from a confrontation with its biggest enemy, Iran. Now that's like when you bring the toughest guy in your family to a bar fight and he runs away. Not a good look at all.
What Iran is doing is testing where that line is, how much it can get away with in targeting US interests, whether those are military interests or economic interests. And really testing the US in terms of its response.
Now, since the 7th October Hamas attacks, there have been more than 150 strikes by Iran-backed militias in Syria and Iraq against US troops. And for a very long time, none of these strikes actually resulted in deaths, a fact that allowed President Biden to hold off on any escalation. It allowed him to ignore a growing number of reports in the US media about how American troops in the Middle East were reporting traumatic brain injuries. He could also safely ignore the deaths of 2 US Navy SEALs who disappeared during a naval operation. The Pentagon said their mission was to intercept weapons from Iran headed to Houthi fighters in Yemen. Now, the clandestine special forces nature of that mission allowed for a vague explanation and a vague response. But what Biden may feel compelled to do after the TAR 2022 attack is send more troops to the region. This would boost morale, it would send a signal to US allies, it would help further secure US bases and also act as a greater deterrent. But it also puts more US soldiers in harm's way. Because let's face it, the attacks on US targets in the Middle East are unlikely to stop without a political decision. And that brings us to the second big reason why Joe Biden will not start an active war in the Middle East. Because the US is unlikely to win that war.
Under crooked Joe Biden, our country is dying. Our country is really in a position it's never been. It's never been in this dangerous a position. We have a chance of being in a World War III with weapons the likes of which nobody has ever seen before. I've seen them because I've seen what they can do. And this would be obliteration. I say this wouldn't be 2 army tanks running back and forth shooting. This is obliteration.
Yes, the US has the world's strongest military. Yes, its air power and its naval strength could pound any militia into the ground. But for decades now, the US has become used to fighting proxy wars, to arming militaries that are not its own, to fight with intelligence, surveillance, and strategy rather than active combat. And this has no doubt saved American lives while keeping the American economy well-oiled. No US president would want to change that status quo. Now, in the Middle East, if it came to a hot war, the US would be fighting far away from home against a well-entrenched enemy in a region where it needs support from the countries it's using for its bases.
I don't think the intention is to have a big war, and it has to do also with what's going on in Gaza. What's going on in Gaza is not acceptable Arab-wise, it's not acceptable world-wise.
Plus, the Saudis just struck a peace deal with Iran, brokered by China. Why would they want to upset that? There's something else common to Saudi Arabia and Iran today: BRICS. Gone are the days of a US shock and awe invasion like in Iraq. And we know what happened after that. The Middle East today is a very different place. And the US appears clueless about just how different it is. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said at the Atlantic Festival that the Middle East was more peaceful today than it had ever been, right before 7th October blew up in his face. With its persistent support of Israel, the Biden administration has already alienated several of its allies in the Arab world. In its fight against the Houthis, it's been unable to convince 2 states that fought a 7-year war with the Houthis, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to join its Red Sea task force, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE understand what the Biden administration appears to be missing: that it's nearly impossible to dislodge an indigenous insurgent movement without a huge commitment of ground troops, no matter how advanced your air defense and your missiles.
Are the airstrikes in Yemen working?
Well, when you say working, are they stopping the Houthis? No. Are they going to continue? Yes.
And even if you do storm in and claim a victory, it's costly to maintain an indefinite occupation. The US learned that the hard way in Iraq and Afghanistan. Will the American voter support an administration which repeats that mistake? And that's just the Houthis. Taking on Iran is a very different prospect. The US government has so far been on overdrive to project that it does not want a war with Iran.
We are not looking for a war with Iran. We are not seeking a conflict with the regime in a military way.
That's a tough line to maintain, though, when your political rival is saying things like this.
You got to do it. You got to get it done. But it's so important that I have to say this. This should have never happened. When I was president, Iran had no money. They had no money to do this.
So for Biden, it comes down to which is the greater risk: being the old president who started a new war, or the president who watched as the world burned.